Who would have known that what began as a secret passion would end in betrayal, bloodshed, and a shocking murder that stunned the entire community? How far would someone go to protect their desires, and at what cost? The sweltering summer heat pressed heavily on the colonial streets of San Miguel de Allende, a picturesque town known for its cobblestone alleys and vibrant artisan culture. Behind the facade of colorful buildings and bustling markets, a darker story unfolded, a tale of betrayal, forbidden love, and murder. It began with Elena Morales, a woman whose life seemed perfect to those who observed it from a distance. Elena was the epitome of grace, a beloved wife to Marco Morales, a successful entrepreneur in the textile industry. Marco was known for his boisterous personality and his ability to light up any room he entered. Together, they seemed like the golden couple, hosting lavish dinners and attending high-profile events. But beneath the surface, cracks had long since formed in their marriage. Elena was once a young artist with dreams of painting the world, but she abandoned her aspirations to fit into Marco's carefully planned life. Her days were spent managing household staff and entertaining guests she barely knew, while Marco built his empire. It was a gilded cage, and Elena felt herself suffocating. It was during one of Marco's extravagant parties that Elena first met Valeria Delgado. Valeria was everything Marco wasn't: reserved, enigmatic, and immensely wealthy in her own right. She was an art collector who had recently opened a gallery in the heart of San Miguel, her reputation preceded by whispers of her charm and influence. Elena and Valeria's paths crossed that night in a way that felt almost fated. The two women bonded over their shared appreciation for art, and what began as casual conversation quickly deepened into something far more intimate. Their connection was electric and had an undeniable, irresistible spark that neither could ignore. As the weeks turned into months, their relationship blossomed in secret. Elena would steal moments away from her structured life to meet Valeria in secret. Their affair was a sanctuary, a rebellion against the roles they had been forced to play. For the first time in years, Elena felt alive, but love built on secrecy is fragile, and soon people started to notice. Marco was no fool. He noticed the subtle changes in Elena, her distant stares, her frequent absences, the sudden glow that seemed out of place in their routine life. Suspicion slowly crept into his mind like a poison. At first, Marco tried to ignore it. After all, Elena had always been a devoted wife. But when he began to dig deeper, the signs were too visible to ignore. One evening, while reviewing receipts from their joint accounts, Marco discovered a series of transactions for extravagant art pieces, all purchased from Valeria's gallery. It didn't take long for him to piece together the connection between the two women. Consumed by rage and betrayal, Marco confronted Elena. The argument was too loud. Marco demanded an explanation, but Elena refused to speak, her silence further igniting his anger. That night, something in Marco shifted. He was determined to reclaim control of his life and his wife. Unknown to Elena, Marco began monitoring her every move. He hired a private investigator to follow her, and within days, the affair was confirmed. Photographs of Elena and Valeria in an intimate embrace landed on Marco's desk. Marco's response was swift and harsh. He confronted Valeria at her gallery, issuing threats that left her visibly shaken. He vowed to ruin her reputation, to expose her to the conservative community that had long whispered rumors about her sexuality. Marco even considered legal action, using his influence to ensure Valeria's downfall. Elena, torn between her love for Valeria and her fear of Marco's wrath, she felt trapped. The weight of the incident threatened to crush her, and the vibrant world she had built with Valeria began to scumble under the shadow of Marco's vengeance. As the tension escalated, Valeria proposed a solution, one that would free Elena from her torment once and for all. It was a desperate plan, but to Elena it felt like the only way out. Marco had to be eliminated. Elena was hesitant at first. The idea of taking a life, even Marco's, was unthinkable. But Valeria was persuasive. Marco's control over Elena would only tighten, and his threats against Valeria would soon become action. If they wanted to be free, there was no other choice. The plan was devious, as cold and calculated as the woman who had devised it. Valeria, with her connections and resources, would take care of the details. Elena's role was simple: play the grieving widow once it was done. Marco's routine made him an easy target. Each evening, he would sit in his study with a glass of whiskey while looking over business reports. Valeria arranged for a potent sedative to be delivered to Elena, who was instructed to slip it into Marco's drink. Once he was unconscious, Valeria's hired accomplice would take care of the rest, staging the scene to look like a burglary gone wrong. The night arrived with an eerie stillness. Elena's hands trembled as she prepared Marco's drink. The weight of her decision was weighing her down. You seem to be enjoying the documentary. Subscribing to our channel gives you better access to more interesting ones, just like this one. She told herself it was for the best, that Marco's death would free her from the prison of their marriage. When Marco finally collapsed, his breathing shallow and uneven, Elena's heart pounded in her chest. Valeria's accomplice emerged from the shadows, his face covered with a mask. He worked quickly, his movements precise as he staged the scene, scattering valuables and overturning furniture to mimic a robbery. By the time the authorities arrived, Elena pretended to be surprised at the incident. She played her part flawlessly, her tears genuine, as she mourned the man she had once loved. But as the investigation began, cracks began to appear in their carefully constructed plan. Marco's death, ruled as blunt force trauma, was suspiciously clean for what was supposedly a robbery attempt. The valuables left behind didn't match a typical robber's modus operandi. Furthermore, the hired accomplice, though professional in execution, overlooked one important detail: traces of the sedative in Marco's bloodstream. Toxicology reports revealed the presence of a drug that wasn't easily accessible to the public. When questioned, Elena claimed ignorance, attributing Marco's death solely to the intruder. But as days turned to weeks, investigators began piecing together subtle clues that pointed to a more devious story. The first real breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the private investigator Marco had hired before his death. Unaware of his employer's fate, the investigator provided the police with photographs and evidence of Elena's affair with Valeria Delgado. These documents raised questions about Elena's motives, casting a shadow of doubt on her grief. In a town as small and interconnected as San Miguel de Allende, the gossip spread like wildfire. The whispers about Valeria's reputation as a seductress now turned into speculation about her role in Marco's death. Valeria's wealth and influence had kept her safe from scrutiny for years, but this time her name was directly tied to a murder. Elena, meanwhile, struggled to maintain her pretense. The guilt of her actions weighed on her, especially as detectives began to question her more aggressively. Her rehearsed, planned stories began to shake under the weight of persistent interrogation. She stumbled over details, contradicting herself in ways that didn't escape the sharp eyes of the investigators. But what truly shifted the case was a single, careless mistake. Valeria, confident that her wealth and connections would shield her, made an unwise move. She contacted Elena through an encrypted message app, expressing her relief that everything had gone smoothly. Unknown to Valeria, Elena's phone had been confiscated as part of the investigation. The police were already combing through her digital activity when the message came through. This revelation was a game changer. Suddenly, Valeria was no longer a mere footnote in the investigation. She was a suspect. The authorities now had reason to believe the murder was planned, with both women playing active roles. Valeria, realizing the walls were closing in, attempted to flee. She liquidated assets and withdrew large sums of money, preparing to escape. But her movements didn't go unnoticed. Surveillance footage from local banks and airports provided a clear trail, and within days, an arrest warrant was issued. For Elena, the dream of freedom had turned into a nightmare. She was arrested at her home, the once sea-beautiful villa that now felt more like a tomb. Her cries of innocence fell on deaf ears as she was taken into custody, her image splashed across newspapers and television screens. Valeria, on the other hand, managed to avoid capture for weeks, her vast resources keeping her one step ahead of the law. But her arrogance proved to be her undoing. Believing she had outsmarted everyone, Valeria attended a private auction in Guatemala. where she was recognized by an off-duty detective from San Miguel. The detective alerted local authorities, and within hours Valeria was apprehended. The arrest made headlines across San Miguel de Allende, the glamorous art collector revealed as a suspect. Once in custody, both women were subjected to a series of questioning. Elena, broken and remorseful, confessed to her role in Marco's death but claimed she had been manipulated by Valeria. She painted a picture of a controlling lover who had planned every detail of the crime, leaving her with no choice but to comply. Valeria, however, was defensive. She denied all allegations, insisting she did not know of Marco's death. Her lawyers argued that the message found on Elena's phone had been taken out of context, a simple expression of concern rather than an admission of guilt. The trial that followed captivated the nation. Prosecutors portrayed Valeria as a master manipulator, a woman who used her charm and influence to bend others to her will. Elena, they argued, was both a victim and a perpetrator, her love for Valeria blinding her to the consequences of their actions. The defense, however, painted a different picture. They highlighted Marco's alleged abusive behavior, suggesting that Elena had acted out of desperation rather than hatred. Valeria's team, meanwhile, focused on her reputation, casting doubt on the idea that she would involve herself in such a reckless crime. As testimonies were heard and evidence presented, the courtroom became a battleground of conflicting arguments. Marco's friends described him as a devoted husband, while others exposed the darker side to his personality. Valeria's former employees spoke of her charisma, but also mentioned her ruthlessness, adding fuel to the prosecution's case. Elena's tearful confession was the most damning evidence of all. She admitted to poisoning Marco's drink, her voice trembling as she recounted the moments leading up to his death. But when asked why she had done it, her answer was chilling. "I thought I had no choice. Valeria made me believe it was the only way." Valeria's response to Elena's testimony was a cold, unwavering denial. "She's lying to save herself," Valeria said in her statement. "I had nothing to do with this." The trial became a spectacle, taking over headlines across San Miguel de Allende. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse daily, journalists and curious locals seeking for glimpses of the two women at the center of the drama. The prosecution portrayed the murder as a cold, calculated act of passion and greed. Elena sat pale and withdrawn in the courtroom, her face streaked with tears as the prosecution replayed every detail of her confession. Each word felt like a dagger, cutting away at her carefully constructed defenses. The courtroom was captivated by her testimony, an emotional recounting of how her love for Valeria had blinded her to the morality of her actions. But the prosecution wasn't interested in sympathy. They unveiled damning evidence: the private investigators' photographs of Elena and Valeria, receipts for the sedative traced back to a pharmacy in Valeria's name, and, most incriminating, Valeria's message that had been intercepted. They painted a picture of a controlling, manipulative lover who had lured Elena into a deadly conspiracy. Valeria, in stark contrast, remained stoic, her expression unreadable as witness after witness testified against her. Former employees described her as ruthless and calculating, a woman who stopped at nothing to get what she wanted. But Valeria's lawyers fought back fiercely, emphasizing the circumstantial nature of much of the evidence. They highlighted inconsistencies in Elena's story, suggesting that her confession was a desperate attempt to shift blame. The defense also introduced a bombshell: testimony from Elena's housekeeper, who claimed to have overheard several violent arguments between Marco and Elena. According to the housekeeper, Marco had been a controlling and abusive husband, prone to fits of rage. This revelation cast doubt on the prosecution's portrayal of Marco as an innocent victim, complicating an already murky story. The court was divided, torn between two competing versions of the truth. Was Elena a victim of Marco's abuse and Valeria's manipulation, or was she a willing participant in the plot to escape her marriage? And was Valeria truly the mastermind behind the murder, or had she been unfairly implicated by a woman desperate to save herself? The turning point came when forensic experts testified about the timeline of Marco's death. The sedative used to incapacitate him, they explained, would have taken hours to take effect. This meant that whoever had planned the crime had acted with meticulous thought. Further complicating matters, text messages between Elena and Valeria revealed a pattern of conversations hinting at their growing frustration with Marco. In one exchange, Elena lamented that she felt trapped in her marriage, while Valeria assured her that freedom would come soon. The prosecution seized on these messages as evidence of a conspiracy, arguing that the two women had plotted Marco's murder together. Valeria's defense team attempted to dismiss the messages as harmless expressions of frustration, but the damage was done. The public, already fascinated by the scandal, now viewed Valeria as the puppet master pulling Elena's strings. As the trial dragged on, cracks began to appear in Valeria's composed look. Under cross-examination, she faltered when asked about her alibi on the night of Marco's murder. Her claim that she had been at home reviewing art portfolios was contradicted by surveillance footage showing her near Elena's villa that evening. The prosecution pounced on this inconsistency, presenting it as the final piece of the puzzle. Valeria, they argued, had not only planned the murder, but had been present to ensure everything went according to plan. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury finally delivered its verdict. Elena was found guilty of second-degree murder. Her role in Marco's death mitigated by the evidence of his abuse and Valeria's influence. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison, a punishment that reflected both her culpability and her cooperation with the investigation. Valeria's fate was more severe. Convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy, she received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The judge, in his closing remarks, described her as a woman who weaponized love and trust to commit a heinous crime. In the months following the trial, the story of Marco's murder became the subject of books, documentaries, and endless speculation. The public couldn't get enough of the scandal, dissecting every detail of the case in search of answers. Was Elena really a victim, or had she used Valeria as a scapegoat? And had Valeria acted out of love? Or was her motive purely selfish? From her prison cell, Elena began to reflect on the choices that had led her to this point. She wrote letters to her family, expressing remorse for her actions and acknowledging the pain she had caused. But in moments of silence, she couldn't help but think of Valeria, the woman who had shown her a world of passion and possibility, only to drag her into a nightmare she could never escape. Valeria, for her part, remained defiant. In interviews with journalists, she maintained her innocence, claiming that she had been framed by a system eager to vilify a successful, independent woman. But her protests fell on deaf ears, her reputation forever tarnished by the crime. San Miguel de Allende, which was once a town defined by its beauty and culture, now bore the stain of the scandal. The villa where Marco had died became a macabre tourist attraction, its walls whispering secrets of love, betrayal, and murder. The town of San Miguel de Allende tried to move on, but the story of Marco's death and the scandal surrounding it lingered like an unshakable shadow. Tourists visiting the picturesque cobblestone streets couldn't resist asking locals about the infamous case. The tragedy had seeped into the town's identity, making it impossible for anyone involved to forget. Elena adjusted slowly to her new reality in prison. She was no longer the vibrant woman who had captivated Valeria Delgado, but was now a shell of herself, burdened by guilt and haunted by memories. The isolation of her cell gave her too much time to think about Marco, about Valeria, and about the life she had destroyed for fleeting passion. She wrote obsessively in her journal, recounting every detail of her relationship with Valeria and the events leading up to Marco's murder. Passion born from ability had entrapped her forever, and the events leading up to Marco's murder. In her writings, Elena often painted herself as a pawn in Valeria's game. She described how Valeria's confidence and charm had swept her away, creating a bubble of fantasy that shielded her from the moral implications of their actions. But she didn't absolve herself entirely. "I let myself be carried by the tide," she wrote in one entry, "even when I knew it was pulling me under." Her journal became a source of solace and eventually a tool for redemption. Through it, she found the courage to reach out to Marco's family. In a heartfelt letter, she confessed her guilt and begged for forgiveness, acknowledging the irreparable pain she had caused. The family's response was mixed. Some appreciated her honesty, while others couldn't bring themselves to forgive the woman who had taken Marco from them. Meanwhile, Valeria's life behind bars was really different. True to her nature, she remained defiant, refusing to admit any wrongdoing. Her wealth and connections afforded her certain privileges, and she quickly established herself as a formidable presence in the prison. Valeria spent her days reading books on art and philosophy, maintaining the air of sophistication that had once captivated those around her. But beneath her composed exterior, cracks began to show. The isolation of prison stripped away the power and influence that had defined her life, leaving her vulnerable in ways she had never imagined. She wrote letters to Elena, pleading with her to recant her testimony and claiming that they could still have a future together. But Elena never responded. The media's fascination with the case didn't wane. Documentaries, true crime podcasts, and even a feature film explored the tangled web of love, betrayal, and murder. Each retelling added new layers to the narrative, casting Elena and Valeria in shifting roles as victim and villain. The public was divided. Some saw Elena as a woman manipulated by a controlling lover, while others believed she had been a willing participant in a deadly scheme. As the years passed, the story began to fade from headlines, but its impact on those involved was permanent. Marco's family struggled to rebuild their lives, haunted by the unanswered questions surrounding his death. Could they have done more to help him? Had they missed signs of his unhappiness or Elena's infidelity? For Elena, the years in prison became a journey of self-discovery. She participated in counseling sessions and art therapy, channeling her emotions into painting and writing. Her work began to attract attention from advocates for prison reform, who saw her as an example of someone seeking genuine redemption. One of her paintings, titled "Shadows of the Past," depicted a woman standing at the edge of a stormy sea, her face turned toward the horizon. Critics praised its emotional depth, calling it a reflection of guilt, longing, and hope. The painting was exhibited in a local gallery, drawing visitors who were curious about the woman behind the crime. Valeria, however, remained a polarizing figure. Despite her attempts to maintain an aura of dignity, her reputation never recovered. Occasional interviews with journalists revealed glimpses of vulnerability, but they were overshadowed by her refusal to take responsibility for her actions. The correspondence between Valeria and Elena, once a lifeline during their affair, became a symbol of their fractured bond. Valeria's letters grew increasingly desperate, filled with declarations of love and accusations of betrayal. Elena, though tempted to respond, ultimately decided to sever ties completely. She realized that her connection to Valeria had been toxic, built on lies and manipulation. After serving 15 years of her sentence, Elena was granted early release for good behavior. Her departure from prison was met with media frenzy as journalists and curious onlookers clamored for a glimpse of the woman whose story had captivated a nation. Elena returned to San Miguel de Allende, though she knew she could never truly go back to the life she had before. She moved into a modest apartment on the outskirts of town, dedicating her time to volunteer work and painting. Her past remained a heavy burden, but she sought to make amends in any way she could. In an interview years later, Elena reflected on her journey. "I can't undo what I've done," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "But I can choose to live differently, to honor Marco's memory by being better." Valeria, meanwhile, remained in prison, her appeals for release repeatedly denied. Her once powerful name had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of how even the most privileged could fall. The villa where Marco had died was eventually sold and renovated, its dark history masked by fresh paint and new furniture. But for the people of San Miguel de Allende, it would always be a place of tragedy, a reminder of the consequences of passion, betrayal, and the choices we make in the name of life. Though years had passed, the story of Marco's death continued to ripple through Latin America. It became a symbol of the complexities of human relationships and the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most beautiful lives. For some, it was a cautionary tale. For others, a tragic love story. For Elena, it was a reminder of the cost of her decisions, a legacy she would carry for the rest of her life. And for Valeria, it was the ultimate fall from grace, a life defined by wealth and privilege, brought down by the fatal consequences of her desires. If you were Elena, What would you have done? Do you think Valeria should have been given less sentences? If you believe the two women deserve a lifetime imprisonment, then you should subscribe. But if you think the judge did the right thing, then you should subscribe to the channel. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section.